I mean, today what I want to do is talk about what yesterday was about sort of epistemological matters. Today I'd like to talk about what we would more likely call metaphysical matters, and specifically, and who knows whether I'll get to all of them, since yesterday I didn't get to all of them. But the specific things I want to talk about today are what we philosophers call primary and secondary causality, which you may be familiar with. And I don't know to what extent with Professor Barr has already spoken. There may be a little, at least once, right? Yeah. There may be a little bit of overlap with regard to things he said, and vis-a-vis any sort of overlap with regard to what he said, disregard what he said and listen to me. Joking. He's very, very good on this stuff. So primary and secondary causality, and if we can, say something about the Big Bang in relationship to the question of creation, since it's often thought that somehow or another the Big Bang provides evidence of the Christian doctrine of creation ex nihilo. And then something about evolution, because that certainly historically for the last 200 years roughly has been thought to be the single greatest challenge to a kind of Christian Jewish worldview vis-a-vis God as creator. But just to summarize yesterday, at the beginning here to get us back on this, the thought was, broadly speaking, with regard to science sets itself a goal. And I shouldn't say science, because obviously there are sciences. And the different sciences set themselves goals and then choose tools to pursue those goals. And just as you wouldn't choose, for instance, say a carpenter's hammer to sculpt a marble statue, you would choose a hammer and chisel appropriate for chipping marble. You choose the means and the tools for the end that are appropriate for that end. And so since different sciences have different ends, we shouldn't expect that they will use the same tools. We should also not expect that they'll be comprehensive, because by choosing an end, since insofar as we have limited and finite intellects, we choose limited and finite ends with regard to some phenomenon of reality. And so we shouldn't expect that any one science will give us a comprehensive view of reality, precisely because of that choice to approach it in a limited way. And I think one of the problems that we have in the context of thinking about science and religion is a tendency to forget on the part of any particular scientist and science, or a fan of that science or scientist, of the limited perspective that was adopted in order to achieve the goals of the science. And this is what Newman meant when I mentioned how Newman said, you know, what happens is you get a competition for the best, for wisdom, right? The most comprehensive science, as if one of them has to be it, okay? Now, so that's one, to acknowledge the success of science; two, to acknowledge the limited character of science; and three, to acknowledge the possibility that we do need some sort of comprehensive picture. What I don't want you to get out of that, insofar as I finished with Aquinas talking about the necessity of revelation for salvation, what we don't want to think is, one, that revelation is given to us so that we can do better physics, right? Or so that we can do better chemistry, or we can do better biology. Insofar as psychology and sociology deal with human action, well, we might reflect on certain aspects of revelation vis-a-vis our way of consuming or conceiving of human agents, but it's still not going to be something given to us to enrich the physics, the biology, the chemistry, and so on with something that, you know, we find a passage of scripture and we say, look at this. This is about the collapse of the wave packet in quantum mechanics. Helps us to understand that. No. On the other hand, you might say that the study of the world in all these different respects can enrich the study of sacred revelation, and is in part intended for that. Not only the study of the sciences, but also literature, right? History. All these things can enrich our understanding of revelation, and we need to try to enrich that. So I just don't want to come away thinking that And also then the other thing is not that we should think of theology and sacred revelation as kind of the whole of knowledge once you fit these things into it, right? That, again, I'm a Thomist, and Thomas is very limited, as is the tradition of the church, mostly, in saying that what is revealed is what is necessary for salvation, right? Not everything is revealed or needs to be revealed for that purpose. So there's an awful lot to be thought of and to be studied and to be understood that may have nothing to do with salvation specifically, but just fulfilling what it is to be human, right? Living a good life, fulfilling what it is to be human. And that is part of salvation, but it's not that that's part of revelation. Okay, so that's just a quick overview of the epistemological issues that I was trying to raise yesterday. One final thing is this marvelous thing from St. Augustine, right? About the danger, right? On the part, so I've been sort of saying, think of science in limited ways, self-limited ways, that is very successful and so on and so on. But then we also have to be careful, those of us who are Christians, of maybe a certain amount of hubris, precisely with a way of thinking of revelation as doing more than it does. Okay? If the sciences are limited in what they're for, so also is revelation. Revelation is not designed to give us everything. And so St. Augustine, 16 centuries ago, right, when science as we know it was crude and quite often vastly mistaken, nonetheless saw danger on the part of Christians. So I'll just read that out. You may have been reading it as I spoke, but it's a bit of what you might say common sense wisdom for a Christian when confronted with science and other disciplines outside of revelation. There is knowledge to be had, after all, about the earth, about the sky, about the other elements of this world, about the movements and revolutions, or even the magnitude and distances of the constellations, about the predictable eclipses of moon and sun, about the cycles of years and seasons, about the nature of animals, so astronomy, biology, fruits, stones, and everything else of this kind. And it frequently happens that even, I love that, Augustine was such a great rhetorician, it frequently happens that even non-Christians, right, even those pagans, will have knowledge of this sort in a way that they can substantiate with scientific arguments or experiments. Now, it is quite disgraceful and disastrous, something to be on one's guard against at all costs, that they should ever hear Christians spouting what they claim our Christian literature has to say on these topics, and talking such nonsense that they can scarcely contain their laughter when they see them to be toto cielo, the entire universe, or the entire, and so on, the whole shebang, as the saying goes, wide of the mark. And what is so vexing is not that misguided people should be laughed at, as that our authors should be assumed by outsiders to have held such views, and to the great detriment of those about whose salvation we are so concerned, should be written off and consigned to the waste paper basket as so many ignoramuses. Whenever you see, they catch some members of the Christian community making mistakes on a subject which they know inside and out, and defending their hollow opinions on the authority of our books, on what grounds are they going to trust those books on the resurrection of the dead, and the hope of eternal life, and the kingdom of heaven, when they suppose they include any number of mistakes and fallacies on matters which they themselves have been able to master, either by experiment or by the surest calculations? The other night, when I gave that presentation on Harry Potter, I mentioned, either after everybody had left, when I was talking to a few people, or just before everybody left, Augustine's principles of interpretation of Scripture. And one principle is that you are not to give an interpretation of Scripture that contradicts what is definitely known about the world, right? Because as this sort of suggests, and then Aquinas will later say, bad arguments bring discredit upon the faith. So if you're going to make arguments, don't make bad arguments. And for a reason, right? Because this is concerned with salvation. And this line here, right? On what grounds are they going to trust those books on the resurrection of the dead? That's the heart of Revelation. The resurrection of the dead and the hope of eternal life. Well, if we argue badly on behalf of the faith against what we take to be attacks upon the faith, and those people are right on the claim they're making scientifically, why would they listen to us about the resurrection of the dead and eternal life? So that's kind of the importance of this sort of thing that Institute for Church Life is doing, right? Is to say, we should be doing science, we should know science, but we should also know our own faith and what the purpose of revelation is, and so on. So there's more to be said there, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. Okay, now we don't have a blackboard, so I can't use my typical example of this. As I say, I wanted to talk about, I don't even know if I should do any more slides, because I don't know, at this point I'm not even kind of lined up with my slides anymore, I think. Yeah. So much of the conflict and difficulty that seems to be apparent, that's redundant, seems to be apparent, no, is apparent in science and religion in the contemporary world consists of the relationship between the activity of God and the activity of natural causes. I think it's unquestionable that scientists study natural causes, the world around us, the things that interact with one another. At the most basic level, energy exchanges, changes of place. And those might be very complicated in terms of living things, right? The energy exchanges and changes of place and interactions that take place with living things and so on. So on the one hand, you have natural causation, right? The things in the world around you. And then you have the idea that, well, God is active. If you're a particularly Orthodox Christian, you think God is active according to the providential order, which goes down even to the number of hairs on your head, as Scripture says. Right? Every event. Right? Well, so then the question, a natural question arises, and that is, well, wait a minute. I mean, how is it possible for God to be involved in all these things, and on the other hand, these things be really doing what they do? Right? Isn't it kind of a zero-sum game between God's activity and my activity? Right? I stroke the cheek of my son. Well, the most ordinary thing there is to say, I stroked the cheek of my son, and he felt it as a result of my stroking it. And then somebody comes along and says, oh, by the way, God did that. Well, wait a minute, I thought I did it. Right? That's a very simple way of putting a very complicated historical argument about divine causality. So what happens, I'll give you the complicated problem, modern problem, before going back to what the modern problem turns out to have been a reaction to. So there was a medieval movement called occasionalism, vis-a-vis thinking about the way in which God acts in relationship to natural causes. And what occasionalism did, or what it was motivated by, was the thought that the more a natural agent does, the less God does. So it kind of starts with this idea of a competition between, of causes, a zero-sum game. But if you're religiously motivated and have a certain sort of conception of God, you think to yourself, well, God is omnipotent, all-powerful, and particularly providential in the exercise of his power over all events. Well, if I attribute some sort of causality to a natural agent, it might be the case that God is involved, but the thing the natural agent does, God does not do. And the more the natural agent does, the less God does. Okay? On the other hand, the flip side of that is, well, the more God does, the less the natural agent does. Okay? So what the occasionalists did, because they wanted to promote, and as a kind of faithfulness to the conception of God as omnipotent and providential, was to say, and this is very oversimplified, but was to basically say, no, God does it all, and natural causes don't do anything. Natural causes appear to do things. In fact, there are no natural causes, there's appearances. In subsequent modern thought, you end up with this account whereby God has set up the world in such a way, for instance, that when a pot of water is in proximity to a flame, okay, the flame doesn't heat the water to boiling. God causes the water to boil in proximity to the flame. As well as, and this is the sort of part where you think, well, this isn't particularly religiously praising God. He kind of makes it appear, right, that the flame is heating the water and making it boil. So he sort of sets it up such that it appears that the world has natural causation, but it doesn't. Now you might say, well, how does that praise God? Because after all, it makes it look like God is deceiving us, right? And this is extraordinarily oversimplified, but so what happens as natural science develops? It seems as though we're getting a greater and greater account of how it is that natural causes do stuff. So if you've essentially adopted the framework whereby it's a competition between God and natural causes, as you come to understand the natural causes and the way they work, and you become more and more confident that no, really, it is natural causation taking place, well, then you got to kind of push God out, push God aside. God does less and less and less and less and less. Right? You might even get to the point where you say, well, I mean, do we need God at all? Maybe the way to think about God is that, well, yes, God is responsible for the beginning, setting it all up, but nothing afterwards. This is what we might call deism, and deism took on many different forms. So God sets up the laws of nature, and he sets the initial conditions, and now you can see a certain temptation towards a way of understanding the Big Bang, right? Winds up the clock, clockworker image of God, clockmaker, right? Winds it up and then just lets it go. And every once in a while, because he is very powerful, screws with the laws of nature and violates them, which we piously call a miracle. Well, he made the laws. He's the lawgiver. He gets to exempt himself from them. Once in a while, because maybe the machine starts to screw up, and he kind of brings it back in. Right? Like any good clockmaker would, also repairs the clock. Okay? So that's one way of thinking about causality. And it fits very well with ordinary causality, if you think of ordinary agents. And this would be a paradigmatic example. If you and I are rowing a boat, right? The more I row, if we want to stay, well, rowing a boat may be not the best example there. Lifting a weight, right? You and I are lifting a weight, and the more I lift, the less you lift. Those of you who teach your physics, right, you can sum the forces, the vectors. So you can get the same sum out of, say, 1 and 2 as you get out of, or say 1 and 3 as you get out of 2 and 2 in terms of the number associated with the forces. So the more one force does, the less another force does, and if you're a point mass, that works out nicely, right? But if you're an extended thing like a bureau, the more I do, the further this goes up and the other end goes down. But that's what we have to do in bringing the bureau down the stairs, right? So we have to kind of cooperate. We cooperate as causes, mostly. And that's sort of the way in which the issue of occasionalism and then the response to it works out historically. The more we do, the less God does. The more God does, the less we do. However, there's another kind of phenomena of causality in the world. And what you might do with that, by the way, is say you just have two primary causes. Neither one is ordered to the other one, but they cooperate. Okay? But consider a different way in which causality might work in some instances, even within the natural world. You all have laptops. Usually I have a blackboard, so I'm using a piece of chalk. Okay? Those of you who are taking notes and those of you who are writing, but I'll just go with the writing because laptops are a new example for me. But those of you who are writing, there's writing appearing on the page. That writing appearing on the page is an effect. It's a very complicated effect. It's not just color against a white background. It's writing. It says something. This guy teaching this seminar is brilliant. Right? Anybody write that down? Oh, I forgot something though. Does anybody have a dollar bill? Or a $5 bill? Thank you. We're writing, right? And you writing, boy, that was pretty damn funny, right? Wrote that down in your notes. Complicated effect. Why the hell did he do that? You wrote that in your notes. Why? He put the... And now he's just going on as if that didn't even happen. So you're writing in your notes, and it's a piece of writing. The intelligibility of the effect is very complicated. As I say, it's not just color against a different colored background. It expresses a thought as a piece of writing. So if we want to understand that effect, we can't understand that effect simply as the movement of a piece of metal with a certain chemical in that metal coming out of that metal. Because that account would simply account for the color that is on the page now, which is a genuine effect. And we can assert that that's genuine causality. Right? It really did leave that color on that page. But if we want to understand the fullness of the effect, we also have to understand that it's a piece of writing. It's a sentence. It says something. And that isn't accounted for simply by appealing to the piece of metal being designed, or piece of metal leaking a chemical as it goes across the page. That aspect of the effect is accounted for by speaking of the writer. It's a piece of writing. Writers write. Pens write in virtue of writers. Pens write because enabled to do so by a writer. Okay? So in that effect, to give an account of the fullness of the effect, we have to appeal to two causes. But notice it's not like the two people lifting. Right? It's not two causes not ordered to one another other than their cooperative lifting. And you wouldn't say that the pen is cooperating with me. Right? The pen is a kind of instrument of my causality. And enabled by me to, it's not just enabled by me to participate in my writing, it's enabled by me to leave the chemical on the paper that it otherwise can't unless I use it to write or to draw or whatever it happens to be. So it has this capacity to cause something, but that capacity is not sufficient of itself even to become actual and have that effect without my causality enabling it to discharge its causality. That shows a kind of order, not a temporal order, but a kind of order of what you might call primacy or primary to secondary. The pen is a secondary cause. I'm the primary cause. We're both cause of the effect. The effect is on the paper as a piece of writing of a certain color. The pen participates in my writing, so it can be said to cause the writing by participation. And I enable it to do its primary effect, which is leave chemical on paper. Okay? This is what philosophers call an order of primary and secondary causality. As opposed to two pens, you have a writer and a pen. The efficacy of the pen depends upon the use of the writer. So the pen is secondary, the writer is primary. What's crucial there? as opposed to the two primary causes lifting. They're not competing with one another for who's responsible for the parts of the effect. There's no competition there, precisely because the secondary cause is enabled to cause in virtue of the primary cause. When I enable you, not in the pejorative sense of I'm an enabler, but when I enable you to do something, it doesn't make any sense to say, well, are you in competition with me? Or am I in competition with you? Okay. So that would be a different possible way of thinking about the relationship between God and natural causes, as not competing, where the more the natural cause does something, the less God does. To make the analogy, what you would end up saying is something like, well, the secondary cause, which is the natural cause, is enabled to genuinely and really cause natural effects in some fashion by God as primary cause. Right? And not competing with God. And not saying, well, the more that the secondary cause does, the less God does, or the more God does, the less the secondary cause does. Everything the secondary cause does is enabled by the primary cause. Okay? Now, let's pause for a minute. Any questions about that? Yes. Oh, microphone. It's going out onto the audience of billions. Everything you say will be heard by billions and billions and billions of people. People of a certain age will catch the reference. Billions and billions.
All right, so I'm not sure if this is going to be exactly what's with the causality, but I came from went to a Christian high school, and so a variety of backgrounds, and you got some, and the ones that are more, I guess, the evangelical theologians for them, they always talked about Calvinism and the big, predestination idea. So
predestination.
Yeah, that's the
reprobation, double reprobation.
So I mean that's
double reprobated.
So coming from with that Christian influence there, and with the evangelicals, especially in Michigan, you've got there's a lot of, especially with them. I have friends actually that went to Calvin and all that, but
I have friends who teach there.
So would like predestination then be a total where everything would be caused by God and the natural causes are following along and it's no free will?
Well, I hesitate because, as I said yesterday, I'm not a theologian and I'm not just bragging. But I don't want to say too much about this. You can probably answer this better. But the little bit I would say is you could say that there's a kind of analogy. Because the question of predestination and reprobation and so on is a question of salvation and the merit of works and so on and so on. So you can sort of see a kind of analogy there with regard to God in relationship to natural causes, God in relationship to my activities, right, vis-a-vis grace and salvation, right? And my sense would be, in a very crude and oversimplified fashion, is that that way of thinking would be a sort of suggestion that if you were to attribute anything to the human act in salvation, you would be taking away from God's overwhelming grace and overpowering grace. And so you also get the whole thing about the irresistibility of grace, the Calvinist tulip, right, which I always forget exactly how to work it out. Total depravity. Unconditional election. Yes, unconditional election. Limited atonement, irresistible, and the perseverance of the saints, right? So, and against the background, it all goes back to Augustine and how to understand Pelagianism and semi-Pelagianism and all that stuff. So, but you see a parallel there, right? Versus the sort of Roman Catholic position, which is, well, your acts merit only as enabled by God's grace, right? So it's seeing it not as a competition between my act and God's graceful act, right? Enabling my acts to merit, if I'm expressing that right as a Roman Catholic, and I'm perfectly subject to the authority of the church to correct me. So nobody report me. I have a friend who works in the CDF too. He's heard my craziness before. So yes, so you can see an analogy, at least, if not even a stronger kind of thing. Comes out in Catholicism between, to a certain extent, the Bonasians and the Molinists, the Jesuits and the Dominicans and the Jesuits, and the Pope finally says to them, stop, right? They were excommunicating each other over these sorts of issues. But yeah, there's a parallel, I think. Yes, Father? Oh.
Pass that over, please.
I always thought of causality as God as first cause, and it troubled me when we talk about second cause, in that, for me, that does bring up the clockmaker understanding.
Right.
I've always kind of referred to it as participating cause, and I'm wondering what you think about that, which in my view kind of gives us the opportunity for free will.
Right.
Is that fair?
Well, your worry, I think, is fair. The worry is that the language of primary and secondary seems to be, it's hard not to think of that as God doing something first and then us doing something subsequently in a kind of quasi, if not straightforward, temporal sense, right? So God starts it all up, and then the secondary causes are secondary because they weren't there at the beginning. They were the result of the beginning, or any other number of ways you would put it. But the notion here of primary and secondary should not be thought of in temporal or quasi-temporal ways, right? They should be thought of in simply as a kind of order whereby the actual efficacy of the one cause requires the simultaneous efficacy of the other cause, and not vice versa. So the pen, right? For it, it's not that I do something prior to the pen in virtue of it's writing. I mean, if I design the pen, then I do, right? But I mean, as a writer, right, I don't do something first and then it writes. Right? It writes because I'm writing with it. And it's writing with me, and that's why I say it participates in my activity. I don't participate in its activity. So there is a kind of priority there of participator and participated, yes, participator and participated. The participator is the secondary, the participated is the primary. So yeah, I mean, it's a definite worry that to be taken account of, but I don't think you have to worry about that vis-a-vis. Once you sort of see that, yeah, it's not like I push the pen and it writes, right? It only writes because I pick it up and I write with it. And so you can also think of it as a instrumental causality. It's an instrument of my causality. And just like the sculptor doesn't sort of do something to the hammer and the chisel, and then subsequent to him doing something to the hammer and the chisel do something. You see?
Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, why don't we just keep the microphone there, and we'll then turn it off for me, and then we'll pass it around the next time we have questions.
So, one of the interesting things about this, then, if you apply it to natural causality, why would you apply this to natural causality? Well, because of the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. The doctrine of creation ex nihilo is not that is not a temporal doctrine. Even if the universe has a first moment of time. Okay? The doctrine of creation ex nihilo is not a doctrine about what happened then as opposed to now. The doctrine of creation ex nihilo develops roughly in the 4th century as a reflection upon the almightiness of God, okay, and his providence, against any number of intellectual movements sort of denying that in some form or another. And what the doctrine of creation ex nihilo does not involve is the idea that there was a kind of soup of nothingness, a nothing that in some sense was a something, right? You like the great soup of dark nothingness, and God kind of draws something out of there that existed in a kind of quasi way and he brings it into actuality. The doctrine of creation ex nihilo asserts that everything that exists, in whatever way it exists, and however much it exists, is caused to exist by God, presupposing nothing other than God's activity. So everything that exists, in whatever way it exists, and however much it exists, is caused to be or to exist by God, presupposing nothing other than God's activity. That's the ex nihilo. Nothing is presupposed to God's activity in creating. They're not too complicated arguments, but at least one aspect of that that follows fairly straightforwardly is creation is not something that happened in the past. This is an aspect of this, it's called the doctrine of continuous creation. Not that God is kind of constantly pouring stuff in as you got in the steady state account of the universe, right? Matter's constantly being poured in, or whatever the theory was, I can't remember anymore. But you have this steady state because stuff is just constantly being put in. No, my existence right now is dependent upon God causing me to exist. Now, you shouldn't think of that as, well, then God is sort of some natural cause causing me to exist, because the order of primary and secondary allows for you to acknowledge that natural causality takes place within the context of an order of secondary causes. That order of secondary causes is caused to exist at every moment of its existence by God's primary causality. So it's not like, the oxygen is providing me with what I need to breathe and metabolize and so on, and then there's something coming alongside the oxygen as part of this world, right, adding something into me, which is my existence. God shouldn't be thought of as another natural cause. Once you start thinking of God as another natural cause, bracket Jesus walking the earth. Once you think of God as just another natural cause within the context of the secondary order, that's when you're going to get occasionalism, or its opposite, a competition between God and the other things. I, within the order of secondary causality, preserve my existence by eating, by breathing. That's what I'm really doing, right? By metabolizing what I ate, by my heart beating. These are all secondary causes within the order of nature, responsible within the order of nature for preserving my existence. God isn't responsible in that respect for preserving my existence. He's responsible for the existence which I preserve. And without his sustaining that existence which I preserve, I wouldn't exist even now. Okay? So, what the hell's a miracle then? One thing that follows from this account of divine causality is a miracle is not, and it drives me crazy, right? So, I try to love everyone. I love my family most of all. I think you can have hierarchies of love. And I love my fellow Catholics. But when they say that a miracle is God violating the laws of nature, I hate them. Sorry, but if you say it, stop saying it. God does not violate the laws of nature in a miracle, and that's not why it's so miraculous and gracious and beautiful. I sometimes think one of our problems, and this comes up with regard to the recognition of the holiness of others, is we look for miracles. That's wonderful. Got to have one for beatification, two for canonization, because that's evidence of holiness. What we actually end up missing is the ordinary holiness of providence. Because the doctrine of providence, miracles fit within the providential order of God as very rare things. But while we're looking for these miracles, what are we ignoring? The ordinary holiness of providence, the ordinary presence of God, manifested in the way in which the world works. So we should be looking for providence, not miracles. That is, holiness displayed in providence. I'm not saying we shouldn't be looking for miracles. Again, I'm subject to the authority of the church, and I apologize if I have offended the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Or in this case, the Congregation for the Canonization of Saints. But we miss that because we start to think of divine causality in the ways in which people deny that God causes things. Right? So a miracle doesn't violate a law of nature. Why? Well, to violate a law of nature would be to suggest that in the ordinary workings of nature, God is not causally present. And, a miracle is God sort of hitting the natural causes in such a way that they don't have their effect and something else happens. He's got to kind of suppress them, beat them down, murder them. And there's his violation of the law of nature. Destroy what he has created in order to achieve something. But Genesis tells us what he created is good. And if we read that non-temporally for a moment, that means even now. So natural causality, God affirms as good. So what would a miracle then be? If in every effect, there's the aspect of the secondary cause and the aspect of the primary cause, and God is causally present in everything that happens, including the activity of secondary causes, a way of understanding what a miracle is God doing without a secondary cause what he ordinarily does with a secondary cause. Right? So, heals a leg. And we end up saying, and so that actually makes sense of what the church actually does in the process of investigating a miracle. Try to think about whether or not there's any evidence for secondary causes being involved in this. And what they're not saying is, because if the secondary causes are involved in the healing of the leg, God isn't. But if the secondary causes aren't involved in the healing of the leg, that gives space for God to act and violate the laws of nature. No. God can heal my leg through the secondary causes of nature, and God can heal my leg without the secondary causes of nature. God can produce, for complicated reasons having to do with the doctrine of ex nihilo, God can produce every effect that he does produce with a secondary cause without a secondary cause. Because he can give being to the effect being something that exists. You had your hand up a second ago.
I was going to ask you for a model, but I think another way of thinking of miracles. Let's get the microphone.
Yeah, microphone.
What if I said instead, the one thing I was going to ask you was to kind of model that. So I think in you talking about the healing, that makes more sense. But I'm still having a difficult time grasping that idea of, so how do we define miracles? Because then the word aberration comes up.
Yeah.
Like somehow it's separate.
Well, it is miraculous, right? That's what it means. It doesn't quite mean aberration, but it means cause of wonder and miraculous, right? Out of the ordinary. So it's certainly out of the ordinary in terms of our understanding of the ways of nature. What I'm sort of suggesting is what we don't actually concentrate when we think of God as violating the laws of nature with a miracle is we miss the Hopkins, right? What we miss is the extraordinary feature of the ordinary.
I think of another analogy when you put that, when we talk about saints with the kids, because saints are somehow up here away from us. And so you can kind of take that down a notch and say, yeah, but saints are all around us. They're just the known saints that we have canonized.
Right, and so miracles are evidence of sanctity. They're not the sanctity, right? Because theoretically, although this is complicated, it's not the saint who does the miraculous event as a kind of, primary causality. It's God upon the intercession of, right? if you want to say, what does the sanctity consist in? It's not the two miracles, because that is a kind of point about recognition. The sanctity, think of Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa's sanctity did not consist in whatever the two miracles were, and I don't know what they were. Mother Teresa's sanctity consisted in what she did every day since she got off that bus. And that is ordinary providence within the context of acting as a natural cause in the world, bathing people. That's what her sanctity consisted in. The church recognizes this extraordinary thing because of the miracles, but the miracles don't make her a saint. Her ordinary life made her a saint within the order of providence. And her ordinary life was spectacular, but it wasn't miraculous, except in the order of grace. But that's a whole different story.
It's kind of a Christological way of looking at
Yeah,
the saints. Yeah.
You have a question from online?
I just have a quick comment in response to your question. Sorry. So, like Chris was saying the other day that, he's like the secondary cause, right, of his child being born. So maybe a miracle would be then kind of in response to your question, like God impregnating Mary, right, through Jesus. So that's the miracle. He doesn't use the
That
secondary
was
cause.
certainly miraculous.
Right, yeah, so he doesn't use the secondary cause, whereas usually he would, right? So he's acting out of.
Yeah, so that would be another model. Yeah, yeah. And it's also important to realize, and C.S. Lewis is actually pretty good on this, there are different kinds of miracles, some of which wouldn't count under that definition, because some miracles involve effects that the order of nature cannot bring about, right? So Peter walking on the water, right? So not every miracle is something that could be done through a secondary cause.
Right.
Resurrection of the dead, right? So we don't want to reduce all miracles to what ordinarily would happen, but God does without the secondary causes. But that would be the ones we typically think of, right? Okay? Yes.
Dr. Callan, I know you said you didn't like the idea of violation, but what about the idea of suspension of the laws of nature?
Yeah. That would,
Is that what you just said?
I think that would be one way of thinking of it, is there's a kind of suspension in the sense that what is a law of nature in this regard? I mean, the real laws of nature don't do anything. Laws of nature characterize what ordinarily happens through secondary causes. The secondary causes are the things that do things. They're the things that oomph, right? The laws of nature give an expression or model of that causality. So what one can say is, well, sure, I mean, so we have this kind of model of how these things oomph one another, right? To use a technical scientific term that Professor Barr uses all the time, the oomph and so on. So in that sense, suspending the law insofar as this is not describable with that law, right? Precisely because the laws describe secondary causality, and there is no secondary causality involved here.
So I hope I'm not taking a flying leap, but have we just done an apologetic on miracles?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And what the Catholic Church teaches about sainthood?
Roughly. But
Sort of.
But I mean, I grew up in the 70s, so my catechetical education, frankly, forgive me the word, sucked. So this is all coming back. So I may be still sort of, there may be some from, my colleagues might find some of what I've said here imprecise. But I think it's pretty good.
Thank you.
But that's partially the point, right? Is that the idea is, again, with regard to the idea that there's some sort of conflict between God and science, science studies the realm of secondary causes, okay? And it would seem, if you think of God as intervening, right, as, like I like to put it somewhat imprecisely, messing with the world and messing with us, right, then it looks like miracles are violations. So if you're going to properly understand the order of secondary causality, that's going to influence the way in which you think of a miracle. A miracle does not mess with us, right? It doesn't mess with the world. And in a very important way, bracketing the incarnation of Christ, God, it's not, so we want to think, well, God intervenes to help us. And people are like, no, God doesn't intervene to help us. That's precisely the problem. That's why I don't believe in the existence of God. Because we place all our chips on God intervening. Okay? Now, in Christ, I think that can be called an intervention. What we want to think of as, and of course that's being set up, but it's being set up through the ordinary providential order of nature, right, in the life of the Jews. And that's not intervention, that's enabling. Right? God enables, by and large. He doesn't intervene because he enables beings that are capable of fulfilling what he has intended for them from the beginning.
Professor O'Callaghan, I wanted to run this idea by you because what you were saying about miracles. Is there a way in which you can say that in a miracle, God makes it possible for a natural cause to transcend its ordinary effect?
You have the sacraments in mind.
Yes, yes. And in particular, that we can begin to think
But not
of.
the Eucharist, because that isn't bread transcending its effect.
I have in mind there's a famous correspondence in Flannery O'Connor's letters, the Catholic novelist Flannery O'Connor, and she's talking with a young woman who's only known in the letters as A, because she didn't want to be identified.
This is in The Habit of Being. If you
The Habit of
read
Being.
It's marvelous.
You remember this yet? And theirs, I think, is the most fantastic correspondence that, we only see Flannery O'Connor's letters. But she was referring to, she's kind of trying to draw her to the Catholic faith. And her issue is the issue of miracles being a violation of nature. And O'Connor's response is, no, I think if we were able to see things the way God sees them, these are the resurrection, that's the high point of the law of nature.
Yeah.
We see the laws of nature, we see death as a law of nature, biological nature. But if we could actually see it from God's perspective, virgin birth, resurrection, this would be nature when its creator has a particular closeness to it, allowing it to do what it cannot do on its own, right?
Yeah.
And sanctity goes along with that, right? It's precisely those who give God unimpeded access to themselves that become these extraordinary people who do things that just make us gasp. Because we don't know how we could do that for an hour, much less a lifetime like St. Teresa of Calcutta.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would say there is in virtue of God's grace, right? That is, you have full access to the way in which grace is enabling you to do more than you could do without that grace. Right? And I think that, again, that's very important to see the grandeur of creation. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil. Nature is never spent. Right? There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. He's not engaged in nature worship, but he's seeing nature in a certain way. Right? And the point here isn't then to say, oh, this is all an argument for the existence of God. Because if you're going to argue for the existence of God, it can't look like an argument for the existence of your Father, which takes place within the order of nature. You can marvel at this. As I actually like to say, I've said this quite often, I work on Thomas Aquinas, and I'm trying to figure out ways to make the first way work against objections and the third way work against objections. But the argument I have absolutely no problem with, and I'm not particularly concerned because I think it seems that you have to see it to believe it, or believe it to see it. But the best argument for the existence of God is that science works. Not that science doesn't work. The modern arguments for the existence of God that I think quite often, unfortunately, Christians have gotten themselves up into is when nature doesn't work, we've got an argument for the existence of God. That's called the God of the gaps. A gap in our understanding, God jumps in and fills the gap. And the gaps in the beginning of the modern world were pretty big. So the God of the gaps was pretty big. And then as we got more and more understanding of how the natural causes work, the God of the gaps is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and you got to find a place for the God of the gaps. That's the history of modern atheism, as the great Jesuit Buckley would say, right? We need to properly understand the relationship of God to natural causes. And you're not going to find God by looking for a gap in nature. You're going to find God in the fact that nature doesn't have gaps bracketing quantum mechanics. It's not a point about quantum mechanics.
We have another question over here.
Yeah.
This, I may not ask this right. Does this argument address kind of the capriciousness of miracles? Because when you described deism, and we all kind of laughed, it described it as the watchmaker who then sometimes just chooses to meddle in. But with this argument, you could still say that who sometimes just chooses to ignore secondary causes, to forego secondary causes, and sometimes doesn't. There's still the capriciousness there.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily, but this is setting it within a larger kind of context of what I believe in virtue of faith. I wouldn't think of it as capricious. I would think of it as providential. I don't know why, right? When I suppose I take my child to Lourdes and my child isn't cured. I don't know why that is. I don't understand that in the order of providence. But because of my faith, I believe it has a role in the order of providence. And similarly with regard to the resurrection, right? I think, O'Connor was very adept at a kind of way of talking to people and challenging them and getting them to look at it inside out and so on. But I'd be inclined to say, well, but what God is seeing there is not in a way what nature itself, right, is inclined to, but what nature, because of his order of providence, which graces it, right? So if you saw it from the order of providence, right, you would see that resurrection is the point. Eternal life, if we wanted to go back to Augustine, right? We were not supposed to die in the prelapsarian state. But the reason we didn't die is not because we are animals who don't die, but because as animals subject to death, God gifted us and preserved us from death, along with our efforts to preserve us from death that we ordinarily would engage in. There was something about that state. And that's another thing, the theologians can talk about this, but that these are idealizations. We live in a fallen world, not just a natural world, in the way in which we're understanding natural in this discussion, the way a philosopher would, but yeah, so.
I think we have time for more questions.
Yeah.
Here, let me get you the microphone, unless there's one over here. Is there one? Oh, okay. I'll let you take that then.
It's not exactly a question, but can you speak to emotions?
How do you mean?
I guess I mean in its
That's
role
the
in.
first thing one says. When I
Could you be
I
more
guess
emotional? I
yeah,
think she's.
right. I guess I'm not sure exactly. I've just been trying to form a question in my head about it. But a little bit as the cause and causing and seeing a lot of these analogies, as much as I appreciate them and use them myself when trying to explain Thomas, because I think that's the best way to help students do that. I feel like the emotion is not in there. A little bit of like what she was saying, why this miracle and not that miracle might be the emotion a kid feels, or just in general, the cause of emotions. Like we would say, I can't cause you to be angry.
Oh, you could.
But I might be able to push your buttons and,
This question is making me angry. Well, emotions are part of the lives of higher animals, right? So they're part of nature, right? They have a role to play in nature, especially if you think of them, broadly speaking, as what Aquinas would call the passions, right? The fact of being affected by something enters into the way in which we respond to things, right? So emotions, just vis-a-vis the question of causality, you have to distinguish different kinds of causality in the world, and I can't go through all that right now. I don't think you should think of an emotion as a kind of event taking place in your brain that then causes some other event that maybe reason comes in as an event and blocks from happening, or the will and so on. Human action is a kind of manifest unity of movement with intelligibility and desire and passion. what can happen is when you analyze that action, and so an animal activity, other animal activity, because we are animals, other animals have passions, and there's a certain sort of reasoning, though you got to be careful about that. What happens is the Humpty Dumpty problem from yesterday. You take this complex whole and you analyze it into its features of being passionate or emotional, of being expressing rational desire, expressing bodily desire, and expressing understanding. And then you tend to think of these as separate little pieces that somehow or another interact, and now you're in interaction problems. I was talking with Professor Barr about this before, and we didn't get anywhere, but now we're sort of in all this kind of like, oh, it's like, again, analyzing a hit in baseball. Well, you got the bat, you got the ball, you got the pitcher, you got the air in between, you got the friction, and you put all that together, and there's all this interaction. I think what we want to think of it, things like emotion and desire and understanding, not as individual elements that interact to make up something big, right? How to think about it is very complicated if you're not going to think of it that way. Vis-a-vis the larger question of the capriciousness of God, I mean, that's one of the things we have to do is to let our passion for God inform our passion for one another, right? And why is it that my child does not get it? Then that's a challenge. But if our relationship to God is supposed to be about love, love seeks understanding, right? I mean, you know someone and then unite yourself to that person, but the rest of it is much harder because now you're really going to have things revealed to you that are going to be perhaps challenges. Right? So I don't know if that addressed what you had in mind. So, yeah.
I have a question.
That's fine.
So you could maybe help me with my presentation tomorrow. Could you give us so I'm going to be talking about what it means to be a rational animal. And you were talking...
Be an animal with reason.
That's right. But specifically this idea that the various things, desire, emotion, understanding, we shouldn't just think about these as separate compartments, but as integrated into one creature. And it was made me think about the whole issue of the soul, and the soul is the form of the body. And I'd love if you gave them a short primer that would help me not stumble all over it and follow my face in front of them.
Short primer about?
Format, well, the soul is the form of the body. And what we mean by that, and maybe how to think about that, even today, as an important way of thinking about the human person.
Right. So we have to, oh boy. We have to understand the way in which, say, the Christian tradition is influenced by different philosophical efforts to understand revelation, right? And as the biblical theologians will tell you, soul's not a big term in biblical revelation. It's huge for us, right? Why is it huge for us? Well, because you have this influence in the early church of these Greek philosophical ways of thinking about the revelation. And the thought that at death, something survives, right? Why pray for the saints, right, if nothing survives of the saints, right, and so on. And that is biblical, right? And saint in the broad sense of saint, used in the early church, not the canonized, well, why do you have to pray for the saint? Because the saint's in heaven, and so on. So in Greek thought, you had the notion of soul, P-S-Y-C-H-E, transliterated, psyche, as principle of life. It ultimately came from, and this is a very crude etymology, but I mean, it was associated with the idea of breath. Why would you think there's soul? Well, you want to know whether something's dead in the ancient world? Hold up a glass to whatever it breathes through. If you don't see any mist collect there, any breath collect there, it's dead. It has no soul. Okay? If you see breath, it has soul. Not because the breath itself was the soul, but maybe in some very ancient notion, but because that's a sign of life, that the principle of life is present. Now, because I have friends who teach these things in ancient I don't want to give names to these things because they'll say, he never said that or he never thought that. But one way of thinking of the soul is kind of as a thing distinct from the body, okay? And as something that sort of acts upon the body to make the body do things, as if a puppeteer. Some analogies you would get is a pilot in a ship, a prisoner in a cell. So the body's like a prisoner. The body's like a cell and the soul is trapped in it. And the task of life is for the soul to free itself from that cell. And so in a way, the soul is foreign to the body. That had its influence on some strands of Christian thought. I think it's a mistake. Another way of thinking of the soul is not as a thing distinct from the body, but its intelligibility as a living thing. We have to be careful of the analogy, but we've got some paper here. Let's suppose it was bronze. Well, the bronze has a shape, and that shape of the bronze gives to this object its intelligibility as a cup. But the shape isn't distinct from the cup, a distinct thing from the cup. Or you could think of a bowling ball made of bronze. The bowling ball rolls for a number of reasons. It rolls because it's solid, because it's bronze. If it was water, you can't even get it going, right? You take some water and try to bowl with water, okay? But freeze it and form it into a sphere, you could bowl with it until it melted. So you have this stuff, bronze, which is solid, but it has this sphericity. The sphericity isn't distinct from the bronze. It's the intelligibility of the bronze as a bowling ball. Okay? But that's not just the reason it rolls. I mean, if it was a cube, if it had the shape of a cube, it wouldn't roll. It would go boom, 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 and stop. But it rolls specifically because it's a sphere. It also rolls, though, because I throw it. Okay? And I am distinct from it. Okay? And it rolls because it's solid and can maintain that shape. Okay? It also rolls because I'm playing a game of, I'm bowling. I've got a goal in mind that I'm pursuing that is achieved through the bowling ball and my desires for that end. So very briefly there, I gave you the 4 Aristotelian causes. Form, matter, end, agent. I'm the agent. The form in that example is the shape. The matter is the bronze. The end is knock down the pins. Okay? Okay, the disanalogy is the form, that shape, isn't what the bowling ball is in terms of it being bronze. The idea is the bronze itself has to have an intelligibility. Right? Because the bronze, at some level, could be something else than bronze. If we had the philosopher's stone, for instance. Right? You can go far enough down and you say, well, you could do something to this such that it isn't bronze. Okay? And then, well, what about the dog? Well, the dog is a dog, right? Even when it doesn't have the shape of a dog. Right? So, dog lovers, I'm a dog lover, loses its legs. It's still a dog. In fact, it's a dog suffering from the loss of its leg because it's a dog. Trees don't suffer the loss of their legs. They don't suffer not having legs. They suffer not having limbs. Right? It's because of what they are, their intelligibility as what they are, that suffering is possible for them. Okay? So the notion of soul that you get as a contrast with the thing inside the body, moving the body around or imprisoned in it, is the intelligibility of what I am. The dog could eat me and it will become dog matter, or what remains of me will become dog matter. It'll become canine. And yet, so there's something about the idea that there's the same stuff in me as in the dog. But the dog lives an intelligible life as a dog. And I live an intelligible life, same stuff, roughly, underlying stuff, as a human being. Not because there's this special thing in there shaping my body into a human being and moving it around like a puppet. I am, to quote Popeye, what I am. I'm a human being. To be a human being is to have a human-type soul as my intelligibility. Okay? But the important thing is I'm the agent. The soul is not the agent. The soul provides the intelligibility or the account of the intelligibility of how I act. So I eat like a dog in some respects, but not in others, right? We reproduce like dogs, like worms, like birds. But there's an intelligibility to our reproduction that you don't find in other animals. One of the things we do is we celebrate reproduction with a feast called a wedding feast. We bind to one another exclusively and celebrate that. We celebrate sex publicly, but not public sex. There's an intelligibility to what we do. Why do we celebrate sex publicly? I mean, we don't just celebrate it, we license it still. Why do we license it? Because it has a consequence for us as a community. It's how we perpetuate ourselves and live and move and have our being. So we celebrate what is a private act with a public meal. That has an extraordinary intelligibility to it that you don't find in the life of most other animals, if any. But we're still animals. And I am this. I'm not a soul. Thomas Aquinas will explicitly say that in the passage on Corinthians, where Paul says, if there be no resurrection, then we are of all men most foolish. And Thomas says in commentary, because I am not a soul. And if the soul survives, I don't survive. He actually says that as well. If the soul survives, that I have no hope of. If the soul survives and I do not, I have no hope of salvation because I am not a soul. I am a living human being with an intelligible life in pursuit of a goal. Sorry. So I don't know if that helps.
That helps a tremendous amount. Thank you very much. Now, this is the last time we'll have Professor O'Callaghan with us. So I'd like to permit them to applause, and I'll do so if
Well,
you give me $1.
No.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, this was going to be my question. I've known Professor Callahan probably for 17, 16 years. And as your priest, I'm hoping that there's not theft about to be committed in this room.
So, if we can have 5 more minutes, because we started late. I had a I have a PowerPoint up. I had an Excel spreadsheet up here that I won't go through. I had wanted to talk about the Big Bang. I'll leave that to Professor Barr if he hasn't already talked about it. It's not creation, because it's not ex nihilo, right? It presupposes something, that is, this singularity prior to the bang. So it's not creation, whatever you want to make of it. As Thomas Aquinas says, even if he thinks it's possible for God to have created a world with no beginning, but nonetheless God would have created that world with no beginning. So even the character of time is a creature of God. Okay? So Big Bang is not creation, whatever anybody tells you. It's the result of creation, but it's not the creation. But evolution. So at least one issue that's raised with regard to evolution is the presence of chance in it. And Professor Barr's book is fantastic on this, and I'm really just plagiarizing from him. Not really, but he hopefully won't get me fired for it. So the thought is, because there's chance in evolution, you can't have a kind of providential order. This is a problem for God. Stephen Jay Gould said, if you run the clock back and then let it go forward, again, you would get something completely different. That's actually not true. So what I'm going to say to you now is not, you will get the very same thing. I'm just saying that's not a good objection. Why is that? Okay, if you want to give me all your money, let's play craps. Now, an easier way for me to have done it was with my providential ordering of the class, knowing that I was going to actually do this at the end of the class, I just asked you for $1. So I got your money. Very straightforward way, you gave it to me. Okay, why does Michael Corleone go to Vegas? The whole point there is to go legit, to go legal. to take people's money legally. Because where he is, you can't take people's money legally through gambling. But through gambling, you can take people's money legally. Why is that? Because the house always wins. Why does the house always win? What's that? It's a setup game, but it's not because the dice are loaded. See, to load the dice would be illegal. Well, I will switch to it for just 1 second. I did used to do physics, and what I did when I did this stuff was what are called Monte Carlo simulations, right? Where you put in a probability function of events happening, and then the laws of nature. So if you load the die in Vegas, you will be convicted of theft. That is a crime. But the great thing, and this is a simulation of craps. The great thing about craps is that it has the highest probability of you winning on a hand. It just happens to be below 50%. So the point of a gambling house, right, is to keep you playing. That's why they give you the drinks. That's why they have the attractive women parading in front of the men, giving them free drinks. Because they know that they'll actually make the money back on the free drink, as well as the salary of the waitress. Why? Because in any particular throw of the die, right, it's uncorrelated with the throw beforehand. Okay? Uncorrelated chance. That's what Professor Barr is so good on. It's uncorrelated with the throw. It is not, however, uncorrelated with the rules of the game. The rules of the game set the probability function. And if you keep playing, you could go in there with $1,000. Now, of course, the gambling house has about $1 million or more on hand. And if they can keep you playing in the infinite limit, well, not really. You just have to go in this one. Well, that was the first 100 throws. But eventually, right, if this is, I think the blue is the player and the red is the house. This is one that's really nice because the house looks like it's losing for a long time. But then, of course, it comes back. And the reason it comes back is its probability is a little over 50%. So the gambler's fallacy is that the next throw must make up for the previous ones. No, the next throw has the very same probability. But the probability of a process, this is a point about a fallacy, the probability of a process is not the same as the probability of an event within the process. So the point here is that he who makes the rules, right, controls the game. And that can include a game where every single event within the game is random. It isn't true that if you wound the clock back, on this, you might get a different probability or process curve. But what you do get is the same goal in the case of craps. Now, that's not an argument that in evolution, if you wound it back, you'd get the same. What it is it's an argument that you won't, it isn't the case that if you wind the clock back, you won't get the same result. You just may get it in a different way. Okay? And so the house always wins, and they take your money. I did it much simpler. As teacher exercising my authority, you were intimidated. No, you weren't intimidated, but I asked you for the... What's that? Yeah. And he meant to say, and no more.
Hey, by the way, thanks for ruining my vacation.
Aristotle's fourth cause.
Yeah.
I knew what I wanted to do at the end of the class with that dollar. And so what I did was I acted then in order to achieve an end. That's the fourth cause.
There you go.